Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. So welcome everybody to Insights 22. And our event today is looking at supporting individuals with learning disability and challenges in the criminal justice system. So the real purpose of today is to start bringing awareness to the needs of individuals with learning disability and learning challenges, and we'll talk through the definition in some more detail in a moment or two, which Laura will kindly take us through. But the focus is really to start looking at how we can support those areas of strength and also consider some of those areas of difference for individuals with learning disability and learning challenges. A lot of the references that you'll hear today are in relation to accredited programs, which is the background of Laura and I, and we'll give a bit of a brief introduction as to our backgrounds in a moment. But accredited programs, for those of you who may not have come across them previously, are approaches used within prison environments and community environments to really support individuals towards making those pro-social changes in their lives, to take them away from a trajectory of offending, and to give them the skills to be able to utilise to really desist from engaging in such behaviours moving forward. So what we are, although the focus is on accredited programs to some degree, what we're really trying to do today is really broaden some of the understanding, the application of that knowledge to the wider criminal justice system, to really support your unique roles in working with individuals with learning disability and challenges. And of course, individuals with such needs do present in various contexts. So we're hoping the areas will be generalisable to really give you the skills needed to support those individuals moving forward. So in terms of some really brief introductions, I'm Sunny Kandola. I'm a National Specialist Lead within Intervention Services, and my real role is around the design, the development and consultancy attached to our learning disability and challenges suite of accredited programs. And that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to hand over to Laura to introduce herself and then also to start taking us through what we might want to consider for today's session.
Thank you, Sunny. So, hi everybody, good afternoon. My name's Laura Shepherd and I work alongside Sunny in a parallel role within Intervention Services, supporting the programmes that we've got for people with learning disabilities and learning challenges. And I'm really pleased to be here today to share some of our knowledge and thinking with you all, really. So just to start the session, we've got some things to consider. Sunny's already highlighted, as people have been joining, that this will be a recorded event, so it might be helpful for people to keep the cameras off during the slide presentation, but then do please feel free to turn them back on during questions where we've left time for that at the end. It would be nice to see faces where possible. For those of you that saw the recording notification come up on the screen, you will see that by remaining in today's session, you're agreeing to being recorded. So if you're not happy with that, then please do feel free to leave now. Because the event's recorded, it will be accessible in future, either for CPD purposes or for other colleagues to be able to view the event as well if they haven't been able to join today. Another point on there is that we'd just like to ask if you could leave yourself on mute throughout, please, just to avoid any distractions during the event. But towards the end, when questions are taking place, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can also use the chat function for that as well. And just a final point on there as well, you'll see that the slides from today's event will be shared, so there's not necessarily a need to take notes during the event unless that's going to be helpful for yourself for future reference. So just at this point, before we move into the content of the session, just to check if anyone's got any difficulties or any questions at this point about what we've just covered. Okay, can't see anything in chat or any hands up, so we'll move on, Sunny, unless you can see anything. Okay, so to start today's session, we thought it'd be really helpful to think about the prevalence of learning disability within the criminal justice system, just to provide some context to why we're actually talking to you today about this group of individuals. So as you can see from the slide, within the general population, the prevalence of learning disability is approximately 2 to 3%. And then how this compares when we think about the criminal justice system is a prevalence of 10 to 35% within those settings. So the reason for this variation, I suppose, really, in terms of the criminal justice system and the prevalence of LDC is for a variety of reasons. So there's things like the different definitions of learning disability that we can come across, the availability of different tools that can be used for screening and assessment, but then also as well just the consistency really in the application of those tools and assessment processes more broadly within the criminal justice system. So variations can range quite broadly because of those factors, amongst other things. There is some more recent data than what's on this slide from the Ministry of Justice that was published in 2018, and what that generally indicated was that approximately 32% of females and 28% of males, either in the community in probation or in prisons, have a learning disability, and we think that probably gives us a clearer understanding of the prevalence really in terms of the numbers that we're seeing. So when we talk about learning disability, then it's important to think about what this means as well. So Sunny mentioned at the start of the session that we'd introduce you to some definitions around that, and that's what we're going to spend some time looking at now. So the British Psychological Society define learning disability as having 3 specific factors, and they're outlined to the left-hand side of this slide. So the first of these factors is that someone would have significant impairments of intellectual functioning. So what this refers to is how the brain works. So thinking about things like solving problems, how we understand and remember information, but also thinking creatively as well. And intellectual ability is commonly measured through IQ testing. So within this context, for someone to be diagnosed with having a learning disability, you'd typically expect them to have an IQ of less than 70. The second factor is significant impairment of social and adaptive functioning. So this is about how people get on in their daily lives. So it can be day-to-day tasks such as managing finances, housing, employment, how we communicate with others, how we interact with others, and coping with change is just some examples of what would be encompassed within that factor. And then the third factor is age of onset, and that's defined as age of onset before adulthood. So what we're talking about here is before the age of 18 years old. And within this definition, it's important that all 3 factors are present for an individual to be assessed as having a diagnosis of learning disability. Within HMPPS accredited programmes, this is the definition that we use to define our target group of participants for programmes, and the definition is also more broadly used as well outside of that context. Something that we thought might be quite helpful to highlight today is how people can often confuse learning disability with learning difficulties, and understanding some of the key differences and important differences between what those 2 things are. So learning disability is what we consider a global problem, and what we mean by that is that it affects the learning and intelligence and day-to-day life really of someone across all aspects of their life. Whereas learning difficulty, so things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia and dysgraphia tend to pose more of an obstacle to a specific form of learning or to specific areas of people's life. So you can commonly think about areas impacted such as reading, potentially writing, and mathematics in terms of calculating numbers. Another difference is that many people with learning difficulties generally tend to have average or above intelligence and can function in most aspects of day-to-day life without needing the additional support that people with learning disabilities may require as well. So within HMPPS, our accredited programmes for people with learning disabilities are also designed to support people who wouldn't necessarily fall under the diagnosis of having learning disability, but may still have some of those challenges with significant impairment of social and adaptive functioning. But the difference here is defined on the right-hand side of this screen. So these people would more likely have an IQ of between 70 to 80. And one of the reasons that we broadened out the target group for the programmes is to be more inclusive for these people, because they generally don't necessarily meet the threshold for requiring learning disability services, but they do have some of the needs that people with learning disability still present with. So as you'll have already noticed from this slide and from what Sunny's already mentioned today, when we're working with the programmes, we talk about LDC, so learning disability and learning challenges, and we group those together in that context. So throughout the rest of the presentation, we might not necessarily talk about learning disability, but we might refer to LDC instead. And I think one of the key things just to take away before we move on is just that people with LDC simply just tend to learn and get on differently to people who don't have LDC. So what we're going to move on to now is to just introduce you to some of the accredited programmes that we have got for people with LDC. And one of the differences with this suite of programmes is that we've designed them to be specifically responsive to the needs of people within this group. And it's recognising the strengths that they bring. So all of the programmes that we've designed for people with LDC are focused on strengths rather than what people can't do. We're focusing on what people can. So I'll just briefly talk through some information about these programmes. We've got the New Me Strengths programme, which is a moderate intensity programme, and that's designed for people who are medium risk of reoffending and above, and it's suitable for people with any offence type. It's also available within probation, but also in prisons. However, it's important to know, I think, that within probation, the New Me Strengths programme is only currently available to people convicted of sexual offences. We've also got the Becoming New Me Plus programme. This is a high intensity programme, and it's designed for people who are high to very high risk of reoffending and who have high need as well. It's suitable for those convicted of intimate partner abuse, general violence offences and also sexual offences. And it's also available only in prisons, the Becoming New Me Plus programme. Also, we've got the Healthy Sex programme. So this is available for individuals with offence-related sexual paraphilia specifically. So, for example, who may have an interest in children. And the HSP programme is only available within prisons. We also have Living as New Me. So Living as New Me is available to all graduates of the New Me Strengths and Becoming New Me Plus programme. And what Living as New Me does is allows participants the opportunity not just to really consolidate learning from NMS or B&M Plus, but also to gain feedback as well on how well they're applying skills in day-to-day situations. And then we've also got New Me MOT. So you'll see on the slide here that New Me MOT is in a slightly different colour to the other programmes. And the reason that it's highlighted slightly differently is that because New Me MOT sits within the accredited suite of programmes, it's not actually an accredited programme in itself. So it's actually a toolkit that's delivered rather than by the facilitation teams, but by probation practitioners. And this provides graduates of the aligned suite of programmes, so New Me Strengths, Becoming New Me Plus and the Healthy Sex programme, with an opportunity again to just further practice and consolidate learning beyond the lifetime of the programme. And the way that we tend to contextualise New Me MOT is that it supports the process of effective supervision as well. So one way that we can understand more about a person is by recognising the different factors that influence who they are. And this applies whether someone's got learning disabilities or not. So the way that we do this on accredited programmes is we use the biopsychosocial model, or the BPS model. And what this model offers is a complete approach to understanding somebody, and the biological, psychological and social factors that combine to make them who they are. And it takes account of people's strengths, but also areas that require support within that as well. Some of the things within this we might be able to change, or certainly change more easily, but then there's other things that we can't change. So for example, specific biological factors we may not be able to change. So the biological component of this model, which is represented by the brain, gives us an insight, and it gives us an insight into how our biology can impact on our health. So examples are our genetic makeup, maybe differences in our brain functioning and our brain structure. And if we think about the biological influence that can contribute to the development of LDC specifically, examples are things like fetal alcohol syndrome or a lack of oxygen at birth. Psychological factors include how we behave and how we think and feel. And psychological trauma and abuse are factors that can be linked with the psychological basis for LDC, which in turn can then influence how a person thinks, feels and behaves. We also have social factors that influence who we are. And this is represented on the diagram here by the people who matter to me. And this is the influence of the things that happen around us. And this can be a contribution of many things. So culture, our interactions with family and friends, our socioeconomic status and education are just some examples of some of those things that can influence us. All of the factors within the BPS model influence each other. So for example, our biology can affect our psychology, which in turn can affect our social well-being, which then in turn again can impact on our biology and so on. So within that context, each person's unique, and how these factors combine to influence who they are will be different as well. So the next part of today's session is going to cover some of these areas in more depth, and it's going to help us think about how we can support individuals by being responsive to their individual biological, psychological and social needs. So Sunny's going to take over from here.
Thanks, Laura, for that really comprehensive breakdown. So, as Laura's already alluded to, we've talked a little bit about the definitions of learning disability and challenges. We've talked about how our accredited programmes are structured for individuals with various different backgrounds of offending. And what's really important is understanding what makes individuals with LDC who they are. So just bridging this slide into our next slide, we're going to now be focusing on what are some of the characteristics associated with learning disability and challenges. And what we hope is this next slide starts to put into context how some of the challenges for learning disabilities and challenges might impact upon some of the areas that you work with in terms of the context within the criminal justice system, especially considering we've got colleagues from probation, psychology services, education sectors on the line today. So to begin with, when we're considering characteristics of learning disability and challenges, it's really important to consider perception. So perception is ultimately the ability to understand or interpret something in terms of within our direct and local environment. So people with learning disabilities and challenges might have difficulties with understanding or interpreting information within their local environment. So it's really important to think about how clear can we be when we're articulating concepts or information when we're working with individuals with learning disability and challenges. Alongside perception, really important to consider memory. So memory is ultimately involving the ability to retrieve and use past stored knowledge or information and using that to inform behaviours or decisions made by the individual with learning disability and challenges. So it's ultimately like our own little filing system. So if you think about having a filing system which has information about our peers or what we need to do in particular situations, for some individuals with learning disabilities and challenges, it can be quite challenging and difficult to really be able to retrieve those files, or sometimes that file might be lost or it's in the wrong compartment, if you were following that analogy. So memory is instrumental in terms of thinking about how we support some of this within the criminal justice system, and some of the areas that as professionals you all work in. Alongside memory, we also have comprehension. So in order for us to even process information, to be able to attend to it, we need to pay deliberate attention to the. So if you think about when individuals are speaking to, as staff are speaking to individuals with learning disability and challenges, that's a lot of information to process, a lot of information to kind of consider and think through around what the individual then needs to do with that information. Just a reminder to anybody that has joined, if you could leave yourselves on mute, then that would be brilliant. Thank you very much. It'll stop any distortion in the background then for others too. So in terms of thinking through comprehension, ultimately attention is key, really thinking through how we're supporting individuals to comprehend information. And we'll talk about what some of the strategies you could use when you're working with individuals with learning disability and challenges when we come across to the next few slides. Alongside comprehension, it's probably really important to highlight here that individuals with learning disability and challenges rely a lot on non-verbal information. So if you think about gestures and kind of physical cues to help them orientate what is actually being said, and that supports overall comprehension. So if those cues aren't being used and individuals are solely having information provided in an auditory means, that in itself can be quite challenging for individuals to comprehend and understand what it is that professionals or peers are informing them about. So alongside comprehension, really important to consider attention. We touched upon this in somewhat when we were talking about memory and also comprehension. But in order to process information, understand it and store it, we need to be able to attend to it. And what we do know is with people with learning disability and challenges is sometimes they have limited capacity to do this, or they might sometimes even get quite overwhelmed. In relation to when there's too much happening for them in a particular situation, they need to be able to really focus in on the particular ask or the particular piece of information. So attending to information itself can then, if you think it through, can impact upon comprehension, can impact upon whether people are being able to store that as a memory, for example. And what we do know is if individuals are struggling to comprehend, to store information through memory, or even being able to attend, that in itself can then lead to the impact on things like frustration and those really some of those kind of difficult feelings of frustration or aggression, or appearing to be distracted and not listening, when actually it's just because the environment is overstimulating for them. When considering attention, what's linked to that and also linked to comprehension, as you will see is a bit of a theme for this slide, is expression. So some individuals with learning disability and challenges may find it difficult to express themselves. This is sometimes due to individuals with learning disability and challenges having difficulties with verbal information or verbal understanding. So sometimes they don't have the vocabulary to be able to express that internal experience. It could be that sometimes those emotions and those feelings are just overwhelming, so it becomes really difficult to even articulate what might be happening for that individual. So really important to consider how expression is an impact for individuals with learning disability and challenges. And finally, for this slide, in terms of characteristics, really important to bear in mind visual motor skills. So visual motor skills generally involve the ability to communicate between the eyes and the hands. So it's that hand-eye coordination for some individuals. It allows us to do things which sometimes we take for granted, you know, being able to pick up the items on our desk, being able to play tennis, being able to play golf, you know, such a variety of areas really. But people with learning disability and challenges, in terms of some of those individuals within that kind of subgroup, it may experience some wider visual motor skill challenges. And this is really important to bear in mind around when we're working with individuals to help understand if we're asking them to organize things visually, or we're asking them to use some of that hand-eye coordination in a task, how difficult that might be, especially if we're thinking about our education sectors. Maybe, you know, the process of even holding a pen or a pencil can really be impacted upon through those means. So in terms of really considering these areas, what's really important to highlight at this stage, I think, is the prevalence, the persistence of each of these areas will differ from individual to individual. You know, if we think about individuals with learning disability and challenges, really important that we're not just grouping all individuals into the same box or the same label or the same condition, for example. Really important to consider how individuals may vary in their degree in terms of strengths and areas of difference across some of these areas too. So in terms of linking some of this in, I just wanted to really quickly reference it back to Laura's slide on the biopsychosocial model. So if we really think through, for example, another analogy, and this is slightly going rogue, Laura, so I'm going to apologise in advance. But if we imagine having a cup or a glass, you know, we all drink water generally. If we consider this as a glass of somebody's ability to take in information, their capacity to engage, this is already full for some individuals. If we think, you know, if you're thinking through challenges around memory, we're already filling that liquid in. Challenges around comprehension, we're already filling liquid in. Challenges around perception, ability to engage with peers. So in terms of the room left for people to really be able to engage meaningfully and have the capacity to engage in their environment, sometimes becomes a little bit more. So what we're going to be talking about in a few moments is how can we really build that capacity for people to engage in various environments and contexts. But before we do that, in terms of talking through what are some of the strategies which we may want to employ, we are now going to move on to talking about how some of these characteristics really might present in various settings. So to begin with, we're going to consider the day in a life of somebody with learning disability and challenges in prison. So, for example, we know that individuals with learning disability and challenges struggle with that expression, that verbal language use, and that in itself can make it quite difficult for individuals to express that internal experience that we were talking about. So if individuals are or in certain settings within a prison environment, sometimes they just don't have the verbal capacity to be able to express that in a way, or articulating that in a way. So it's really, we might want to tailor our approach when we're working with individuals in terms of our verbal information, and we'll consider that in a few moments. Alongside language and expressing issues to staff, we've also got a misuse of the room bell. So at times, we know that individuals with learning disability and challenges might not necessarily understand what the purpose of the room bell is, or if that information has already been informed to them in terms of kind of what the purpose of the room bell is, could it maybe potentially be some of that memory or processing information challenges coming through, which is impacting upon them forgetting what the actual purpose of it is. Remember, if we're thinking about that emotional layer of how frustration and kind of that feeling of frustration can really impact some individuals with learning disability and challenges, especially being in an environment where you're not being able to communicate effectively with people or tell them what the problem is, how that might then feed into some of the behaviours that we might be seeing in various settings. Use of a room bell, we've also got difficulties completing canteen sheets. So canteen sheets themselves require quite considerable mathematics sometimes. They involve the ability to read and process a real range of information. At times it involves financial management, knowing what you can and can't spend your money on. So really considering how some of that might be really difficult for individuals with learning disability and challenges, and sometimes they just need that added layer of support in completing those areas. Alongside canteen sheets, really important to consider bullying and social isolation. So there's been some recent literature highlighting how adverse experiences such as bullying can sometimes be more prevalent amongst individuals with learning disability and challenges. So thinking through the biopsychosocial model, or the what makes me me model, which Laura was talking through, really important to consider how those experiences can shape individuals with learning disability and challenges, their self-identity, their willingness to come out of their cells and to go on to visit, their willingness to even articulate some of the challenges which are even happening for them if they've had some quite difficult experiences explaining those issues previously to professionals. So really important to consider how this can give rise to some of those more isolating experiences for individuals with learning disability and challenges. We've also got sensory overload. So thinking about the environment. So within prison environments, it's not unheard of to have overly loud bangs of cell doors closing or room doors closing, people shouting on landings. We've got bright lights and generally fluorescent lighting at times. There's overpowering smells such as products. So, you know, things like these sensory approaches or these bits of sensory information all accumulate. They all then lead to this layer of hyper sensory overload in a setting. So if we think about an individual with learning disability and challenges receiving some information, if all this is going on, how much of that cup do they really have to be able to absorb and use that information? Really important to consider some of that when we're working with individuals in prison settings. We've also got personal hygiene, so really important to consider opportunities for showers. So sometimes individuals with learning disability and challenges might miss the opportunities for showers because they prioritise something else. For example, if in the morning they've got a set allocated time to have their kind of shower in the morning, that time might be then instead prioritised towards the canteen sheet because they feel that they really want their food or the snacks that they really want for the weekend. And that in itself might take considerable more time, and they miss the opportunity to shower or to engage in personal hygiene routines. The other side of some of this is some individuals with learning disability and challenges struggle with understanding what the purpose of looking after hygiene is. You know, what's the benefits to our health? What's the benefits to in their environment in terms of when they're kind of considering hygiene? So, alongside personal hygiene, there's the element of changes to regime and routine. Things in a person's environment change quite rapidly and quickly sometimes for various reasons, which is sometimes out of the control of the participant or the individual with learning disability and challenges. So planning for a day in terms of in the eyes of an individual with learning disability and challenges can be quite difficult. So if you think about having an environment which is constantly changing, that in itself could potentially give rise to some of those feelings of frustration. So if somebody had plans to do a certain thing that day, such as engaging in employment or education because they find that really valuable and rewarding, what might potentially happen is that when those things are cancelled without any information being provided, that can lead to some of the frustrations which then have a knock-on effect to some of the other behaviours we might see in those settings. Alongside changes to regime and routine, we've also got understanding appointment slips. So this comes back to how is information being presented. We know that when information is presented with too much written text, with no imagery to support some of that non-verbal, that non-written language, then that can be quite difficult for individuals with learning disability and challenges and make that approach quite inaccessible at times. So when we're working with individuals within prison settings, it's really important to ask ourselves what's really driving the behaviour we're seeing, what's really driving what's beneath it, what's the actual drivers in relation to what makes the person who they are, which Laura talked through some time back in terms of a few slides back. And also then important to consider how the characteristics that we see for individuals with learning disability and challenges can be compounding upon one another. You know, it's the compounding impact of all of these. It's not just the kind of the difficulty with completing a canteen sheet. It's when the environment isn't moulded and tailored to support the strengths that individuals with learning disability and challenges have, and really promoting some of those strengths. So important to consider that in the environments where yourselves may be working. So we've considered the prison environment, so we wanted to kind of also consider the community environment. So here we have using public transport within the community can be quite a difficult challenge. It's a difficult challenge for many of us on a daily routine, but for individuals with learning disability and challenges, the adjustments to bus routes or the cancellations of public transport and then not being able to meet an appointment could potentially impact upon some of that frustration, some of that tension that individuals feel. And also that could be driven by memory. If we talked previously about memory, comprehension, and also attention. So if information's been provided to them about public transport and they've not really been able to use that information and assimilate it and then store it in their memory, how are they really going to be able to understand how to get from where they may be located in terms of residing to maybe a probation appointment they need to get to? And also considering how that might actually come across. So sometimes we generally see if people miss appointments, it's a experience of potentially disengagement or unwillingness to attend, when actually it could be the live appearance and the live presentation of some of these characteristics that we've talked through today. Alongside public transport, really important canteen sheet, paying bills, managing finances, the compounding impact of some of this. Some of the things that we might take for granted, things like paying TV license fees or paying, for your electricity or your gas or your water. Sometimes not understanding how to prioritize our finances, which is an area which some individuals with learning disability and challenges need additional support in, can impact upon their experience of the community and the environment that they're into. We've also got attending appointments on time. So we talked a little bit about this in terms of there are a multitude of factors as to why individuals may miss appointments, and really considering what might be driving some of that behaviour. Although sometimes it may appear as though individuals are uninterested, it might actually be that it's characteristics which are really live. So things like remembering when appointments are booked, or what day of the week even is it today, understanding what day of the week do I need to get to this appointment. So really kind of factoring in how we could support individuals with learning disability and challenges around some of that. Alongside responsibilities, alongside things like bills, we've also got things like the concepts of cooking and the concepts of taking vitamins to support health, or areas which some individuals with learning disability and challenges may not fully understand or recognise in terms of their benefits of doing some of this. So we talked through kind of personal hygiene alongside the areas of things like cooking and things like vitamins and health. And one of the kind of areas, to give an example of this, is where within society there's been a real push to support individuals with learning disability and challenges to understand vitamin uptake, or really educating people of what the benefits may be of certain health approaches. We know there was a real push in relation to the recent pandemic around some of this with individuals with learning disability and challenges too. So the final point here to kind of make is in relation to employment. So the landscape in relation to employment is constantly changing. Recalling back to how applications used to be very different to how they are now. They're very technologically advanced. Things need to be completed online. And if individuals with learning disability and challenges aren't given the correct support, this can be, again, another area of challenge, not only completing applications and gaining employment, but also maintaining that employment, and recognizing what the benefits of that employment may be for them personally. And again, linking in, if individuals have some of those memory characteristic challenges, then how might that impact upon an individual seeking employment? Remembering when their interview is scheduled for, remembering to take relevant paperwork. So really considering how all of this could have a cumulative effect on an individual within prison and community settings. Okay, so in terms of considering the environment to the person, and we talked about that cup and really building that capacity for somebody to engage, what can we do as professionals? What can we do to really enable people to be their best if they have learning disability and challenges? So some of these areas, the ideal time for technology issues. Okay, yeah, brilliant. So in terms of the environment itself, what we can do is we can have real person-centered conversations around areas of difference and strengths. Really important here, we need to take recognition for the fact that individuals with learning disability and challenges aren't the same to people with a diagnosed learning disability. For example, will have varying degrees of different strengths and different differences. So really important to have that dialogue around understanding what works for the individual. So doing that in an appropriate way when we're considering communication in a moment or two. So really important to have that real kind of approach. These are experts of their lived experience of learning disability and challenges, so we should, rightly so, be putting them at the heart of making the decisions as to what works for them. Alongside person-centered conversations, building responsivity plans. So in any setting, about this in the space of accredited programs, but this is equally potentially really valuable in the employment sector, education, when we're working with individuals from a probation background or psychology background, but having responsivity plans. By responsivity plans, what we mean is having a real clear breakdown of what works for that person, and having a really clear link as to how you're going to operationalize some of that for when you're working with individuals with learning disability and challenges. So for example, if somebody is saying, I really struggle with quite complex language, a practical marker would be, as a professional, you're going to consider how you might rephrase things. If somebody really struggles with memory, you might build in more repetition and really building in that added layer of strengthening their understanding that way. And really important when we are building responsivity plans, that we're regularly reviewing them. So if you think about the strengths and differences, some things on that responsivity plan will be working better than others, some things might not be working at all. So really instrumental to ensure that you're regularly checking that in. So plans, we also encourage the use of timetables. So if we think through what we were just recently talking about in terms of keeping abreast of appointments, when the individual needs to attend an appointment or go somewhere, providing timetables is really helpful, highlighting what day the individual is coming to see you or what they're covering on that day. And we touched a little bit on the cup analogy, but ultimately what also feeds into that cup is anxiety. So if you think about some people attending appointments and not really understanding what's going to be coming up for them or what they're going to be discussing or covering, really alleviating that anxiety by giving them a timetable showing what they're going to be covering on each of those sessions or times that they're coming to see you. So they can pre-prepare as to what the expectation of that meeting will be, or that session or that environment that they're liaising with you in will be. Managing sensory factors, so this is in prison and community settings, is really considering how individuals with learning disability and challenges may struggle to really process information if there's too much sensory information. So before even bringing the individual to a meeting, really consider the sensory factors. So this includes temperature, sound, thinking about smells, talking about textures, sometimes even textures of seats, can also impact upon some of that additional sensory overload for some individuals. So really factoring some of that in when you're working with people. Building a trusting relationship with the individual, so really factoring in building that layer of trust. We know for some individuals with learning disability and challenges, they may struggle to build transparent and open relationships because they may have had quite adverse experiences with professionals previously. So important to build that trusting relationship, really considering where you can bring, supportive and pro-social family into that relationship too. Maybe sometimes family members have a better understanding of what may work for the individual than some of the wider professionals involved in that person's care or engagement of any kind. So really thinking through how we can be creative around supporting the individual in a more holistic manner. So things like building trust can be established through any pre-meetings or pre-engagement meetings, really considering some of that around maybe doing icebreakers, getting to know the individual's history, and really trying to spend that time to build to get to know that individual. So when we talked about communication earlier, we talked a little bit about how we can accommodate various communication needs. So one of the ways is using imagery alongside easy read written information. We know that less is more sometimes when providing written information, kind of thinking things through around 14 font, black text accompanied by an appropriate image sometimes is really useful, and there's been some work in relation to that in the field around how that sometimes supports individuals really understanding information in a written form better. But thinking through, even in various settings, things like consent forms or providing any written information, how that can be really tailored in a way which kind of uses imagery and also less text, but text which is used in a much more accessible way. Going back to the point we were talking about previously in relation to language, and making sure it's accessible. We've also got getting up and active. So this involves using kinesthetic ways of working, and kinesthetic ways of working are really getting up, giving things a go, rather than relying on verbal discussion or talking things through, but or even writing things or reading information, actually physically getting the individual up. We know that kinesthetic modes of learning really support those biological processes of remembering information. So it starts to build that understanding in a way which hopefully can support the individual to be able to recall. So rather than just providing information in a verbal means or an auditory means, really thinking creatively how we can use kinesthetic modes of learning in the various roles that you are all in. And alongside getting up and active, communication. So when we're communicating with individuals with learning disability and challenges, really thinking through the use of easy language or simple language to really consider how sometimes when we use as professionals really quite convoluted and complex language, don't we? It's easy for us in terms of, because we go into this mode of using what's part of our natural vocabulary. And sometimes what we might find for individuals with learning disability and challenges is that they comply and they'll nod or they'll say yes, you know, they understand, but really important to check that understanding and check that understanding with them regularly. Pace is a really key one. So really thinking through how fast we talk with individuals with learning disability and challenges, and really giving yourself time to think things through, gives them time to process and then really build those connections from memory as well. So thinking through pace and practicing pace. It doesn't come easy, and it's really important to build some of that practice in maybe as a professional team. And we've got some exercises we can share, don't we, Laura, around some of that if we needed to. And finally, in relation to explaining and using repetition, so really important to explain your point of view, using the time to use accessible language to explain what's about to happen or has happened for the individual, and using repetition for individuals with those memory characteristics, really making sure we use the time to build in that repetition. We know that repetition linked in with those kinesthetic ways of working can really support memory and recall, so building some of that in when working with individuals. So just before I hand you over to Laura to conclude some of the key points from today, just really wanted to highlight, in addition to that, the idea of having some space for a timeout. We know that frustration and tension sometimes, if that cup is starting to overflow, it's probably not the right time to start kind of providing new information, because that person might not be in a space to be able to really engage effectively. So really providing some space for them to really manage some of those overwhelming experiences. Remember, we were talking about those cumulative overwhelming experiences they may be having, to really support that cognitive load for. Brilliant. That is everything in terms of characteristics, and then also considering an individual's life in a prison setting, in a community setting, and also some of the things that we potentially can be doing in the environment to support individuals with learning disability and challenges. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Laura, to take us through some conclusions.
Thank you, Sunny. So we are heading towards the end of the formal input for the event, so we just wanted to raise some specific conclusions really from the information that we'd shared in terms of messages for people to take away. So I think one of the key things that we wanted to raise is, as Sunny has mentioned throughout that last part really, is that no two individuals with LDC are the same. They will differ both in terms of areas of strength, but also areas of need and difference as well, and where they require support. And I think that's applicable not just to learning disability and challenges specifically, but other neurodiverse conditions as well. So that's where it's really important to have that person-centred approach and really think about what works for them, but also what are the areas of challenge as well, and how they can best be supported. Another point that we wanted people to take away really was about the importance of being responsive. So again, this just really links back to giving consideration to how we can best work with people, and the role that things like the environment can play within that, and how we can adapt the environment to better suit somebody's strengths. Also, a focus on strengths just generally, so really thinking about what people can do rather than what people can't. Being prepared as well, I think, is one of the common areas of feedback that we've had actually in terms of programme teams when we've been to visit them, about supporting some of the social and adaptive challenges that people might have. has been one of the biggest areas, I think, of adaptations in terms of practice for people, thinking about those really practical things that might come easily to some of us, that people with learning disabilities and challenges may need that extra support with. So things like that personal independence, social communication, social engagement, and all the other areas that we've already talked about today as well. A third point, and I think this is probably more so relevant to people who work and direct people into accredited programmes, is the real importance of making sure that where people are identified and targeted for an accredited programme pathway, that they go on to the appropriate referral pathway. So making sure that if you have got somebody who has potentially got these needs around learning disabilities and challenges, that they go on to one of the programmes, or are certainly referred to one of the programmes for consideration that we've spoken about today. And then finally, we would just like to end on bringing it all together, really, in terms of thinking about not just saying something but showing it. So thinking about all the different ways that we can communicate with people with LDC that's going to be really supportive. So not just giving a message verbally, but actually using those kinesthetic methods that Sunny's spoken about, maybe even doing skills practices with them, showing them how to do things, or if you're planning a meeting with them and they don't necessarily know where the meeting room is or how to get there, going with them, taking them and showing them how to get there so it's familiar to them, letting them into the space so that they can see it ahead of time, what's helpful for them within the environment, maybe what's not so helpful, what adaptations could be made. So really important that we use those multimodal methods of communication, really, to support understanding and learning. So I think what we'd just generally really like to encourage everybody to do today is to share some of this awareness as well with colleagues, people that you work with, so that we can help to continue to build this knowledge and understanding and awareness throughout the criminal justice system, really. So within regions, departments, local teams, and then just alongside that to really reflect yourselves on how well you think your team are doing with supporting the needs of individuals with LDC, and what could be done to improve that in terms of support, moving forward. So just finally, I think all that's left for me to say for now is just a really big thank you to everybody for joining us today, and we hope that you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking as well.